Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a super important period for Indigenous rights. Looking at the years 2002 and 2003, our source material this time is the Indigenous World 2002-2003. It's this collection of reports from all over the globe that gives us a really good snapshot of what was going on at the time, both the hurdles and the wins for Indigenous communities during this period. Now, I know a lot of you out there are already pretty familiar with some of the basic issues, but we're going to try to dig a little deeper and pull out those key insights that might not be so obvious.
Yeah, I think what makes this period so fascinating is that you see this global indigenous rights movement gaining some serious traction, but at the same time, they're facing this pushback, all happening in the context of globalization and that war on terror climate after 9/11.
Yeah, it's crazy how these local struggles get tangled up with these huge global events. And speaking of local, one thing that pops up over and over again in this report is land rights. It's not just about owning land, right? It's about culture, it's about livelihood, spiritual morality, like the very core of what makes up Indigenous identity.
You hit the nail on the head. And the indigenous world actually gives this really stark example from Sri Lanka. There's this hunter-gatherer community there, the Wanyala Edo,
Hmm.
and they were basically getting squeezed out of their traditional hunting grounds,
Hmm.
all to make way for things like national parks and, commercial interests.
It's that classic problem, trying to balance conservation with Indigenous rights. Sadly, it's not just a one-time thing. It's a pattern that just keeps popping up all throughout the report.
Oh, absolutely. It comes up a lot.
Yeah.
Then you throw the whole war on terror into the mix, and things get even more complicated. Governments were so quick to slap that terrorist label on indigenous movements,
Hmm.
using anti-terrorism laws to basically shut down anyone who disagreed with them.
Wow, it's like they use this global crisis as an excuse to silence anyone who is fighting for Indigenous rights. Makes you wonder how much has actually changed. But okay, let's shift gears a bit and zoom in on a specific region, the Americas. I feel like you see the whole range of Indigenous experiences there. You've got these landmark agreements in some places, but then devastating violence in others.
You're absolutely right. And I think one of the key themes that emerges in the Americas is this constant tension between economic development,
Hmm.
resource extraction, and indigenous rights. It might play out a bit differently depending on what country you're looking at, but that underlying dynamic is surprisingly consistent.
Take North America, for instance. In Alaska, you've got this huge controversy brewing over the Donlin Creek gold mine. On one hand, you've got the potential for creating jobs and bringing in revenue. But on the other, you've got the risk of environmental damage and disrupting Indigenous ways of life.
Really makes you think about what sustainable development actually means, right? Can you have economic growth without trashing the environment and sacrificing cultural integrity? Indigenous communities have so much knowledge about how to live in balance with nature. But the question is anyone actually listening to them?
And then you look at Canada. They had this huge accomplishment with the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement. But even with this agreement in place, the struggle for self-determination continues.
Oh yeah, the Nunavut Agreement was a huge deal. It gave the Inuit control over a massive chunk of land and a share of those resource revenues.
Hmm.
But if you read the report, it's clear there wasn't some magical solution. Inuit employment in government was still really low. There were challenges with preserving their culture, and there were constant battles over how resources were being developed.
And here's where things get really interesting. The report actually connects Canadian Indigenous policy to what was happening in international relations. The U.S. was planning to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for oil drilling, and that directly threatened the way of life for the Diné people in Canada.
Yeah, it's wild how connected everything is. A decision made in one country can have these ripple effects on indigenous communities across borders. Makes it clear that indigenous voices need to be heard on that global stage, right?
You're absolutely right about that. But let's shift our focus south for a second and look at the U.S. It's honestly pretty disheartening to see Indigenous communities there still fighting for basic respect for their sacred sites. You've got places like the San Francisco Peaks in Arizona and the Zuni Salt Lake in New Mexico. These places hold deep spiritual significance for these communities, and yet they're constantly under threat from mining and development projects.
It's a prime example of how, for many indigenous cultures, land isn't just some commodity you can buy and sell.
Mm.
It's woven into their spiritual identity. It's inseparable.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got the whole mess with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and those mismanaged trust funds.
Billions of dollars owed to these communities, and the BIA's track record. Well, let's just say it's not exactly confidence-inspiring.
It's this legacy of broken promises and straight-up injustice. And it continues to have a devastating impact on tribal economies and their ability to be self-sufficient. And speaking of injustice, the report paints a pretty bleak picture of Mexico, especially the violence that was directed at indigenous communities.
It's hard to forget about the Agua Fria massacre in Oaxaca. Indigenous activists were murdered there. It's a chilling reminder of the risks that these communities face just for speaking out for their rights.
And what makes it even worse is the report points to the involvement of paramilitary groups in these attacks. It makes you wonder about the government's role. Were they complicit? Did they just look the other way? It's a really disturbing situation.
And then you've got this whole complicated thing going on with Maya participation in the Mexican government. On one hand, they're trying to work within the system to make things better, but on the other hand, it's that same system that often keeps them marginalized.
Yeah, it's this constant balancing act for them. Do they try to assimilate? Do they resist? It's like they're trying to find a way to create meaningful change from within a structure that's designed to exclude them.
It reminds me of that saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
Yeah,
But even if you are at the table, it doesn't guarantee you'll be heard.
exactly. And you can see this tension between participating and resisting throughout Central America, too. The report looks at how tough it was to get land titles in Panama and how complicated those mining reforms were.
In Panama, you had the Naso Turibe Comarca fighting for their territory to be legally recognized. But they were up against these powerful economic interests. It just shows how often development wins out over indigenous rights.
And even when they did try to make reforms, like with mining in Central America, the report suggests they often didn't really address the core issues of inequality and exploitation.
So basically, we keep seeing this same theme pop up: development, often driven by these global economic forces, clashes with indigenous land rights and their ways of life. And as we head south into South America, things don't really get much better.
Nope, not really. The report shines a light on a whole bunch of challenges there. Everything from the brutal impacts of that armed conflict in Colombia to the struggles indigenous peoples faced in places like Venezuela, Ecuador, and Peru. It's a region marked by incredible resilience, but also these deep-rooted inequalities.
Let's start with Colombia. Indigenous communities there were literally caught in the crossfire of a conflict that lasted for decades, facing violence, displacement, and this constant struggle to just stay neutral. It's truly heartbreaking.
It really is. But in the midst of all that, you see moments of incredible resilience, like that indigenous uprising in Cauca back in 2001. They were facing overwhelming odds, but they took a stand to defend their land and their right to self-determination. It's a powerful reminder of the strength and courage of these communities.
So inspiring. But then you look at Venezuela, they have this relatively progressive constitution, yet indigenous communities are still facing all these challenges.
Yeah, it shows that having good laws on paper isn't always enough. Those constitutional protections are important, but they need to be backed up by action. There needs to be a genuine commitment to social justice. Otherwise, they're just empty words.
Totally agree with you there. The report then focuses on Ecuador, where you have indigenous groups like the Sariaku fighting to protect their land from oil exploration. It's interesting to see how they're using international legal tools like the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights.
It's such a crucial strategy for indigenous communities seeking justice and accountability. By going to those international bodies, they can amplify their voices and hold governments responsible for upholding their human rights.
And finally, the report dives into this really complex situation in Peru: mining, the aftermath of the Shining Path conflict, the struggle for political representation. It seems like indigenous communities there are dealing with everything all at once.
Peru is almost like this microcosm of the broader challenges that indigenous peoples are facing, both in the region and globally. It shows how those historical injustices, that ongoing discrimination, and those economic pressures can all come together to create a situation where these communities are incredibly vulnerable.
It's a lot to take in, but I think we've covered a pretty good chunk of the Americas. Let's take a quick break here and catch our breath. We'll be back in a bit to tackle the rest of the world.
All right, I'm ready when you are.
Okay, so we've talked about the Americas, but this report goes way beyond that. It really gives you a sense of the global picture of indigenous rights. So let's hop over to Australia and the Pacific Islands for a bit. And, when I think about Australia in the early 2000s, one name that immediately comes to mind is John Howard. The report spends quite a bit of time unpacking his policies toward indigenous peoples, especially his stance on native title and the whole issue of the stolen generations.
It was a pretty dark period, no doubt about it. And the report doesn't hold back on the criticism. They lay out all the arguments against Howard's policies, citing sources like Rosalind Kidd's books, and even Rosemary Neal's Whiteout to give some deeper background.
For those of our listeners who might not be as familiar with Australian history, could you maybe explain why these issues were so controversial?
Well, essentially, Howard's government was trying to roll back native title rights, which were hard-fought victories for indigenous communities.
Mm.
It felt like a betrayal of the whole reconciliation process that was supposed to be happening.
And the stolen generations. That's the forced removal of Indigenous children from their families. It's a wound that I don't think has ever fully healed.
Exactly. And Howard's government tried to downplay how serious it was. They resisted calls for a formal apology and were really slow to offer any kind of reparations. It felt like they were deliberately trying to erase this painful chapter of history.
It really highlights how government policies can have these long-lasting impacts. And not always in a good way, right? Generations later, these communities are still dealing with the consequences. But it's not just Australia. The report also touches on the Pacific region, highlighting the challenges of corruption, the impact of globalization, and that ongoing fight for self-determination.
Yeah, they specifically mentioned Guahan, which is Guam, and Kanaki, New Caledonia. Both places were, and still are, grappling with that legacy of colonialism.
So in Guahan, we're talking about the U.S. military presence on indigenous land and how that affects their culture.
Right, exactly. It raised all sorts of questions about land use, environmental damage, and what happens to traditional practices when that happens.
And in Kanaki, the indigenous Kanak people were pushing for independence from France.
That's right. And the report talks about these really complex political negotiations and that long and often frustrating process of decolonization.
It really shows how that fight for indigenous rights is happening all over the world. Speaking of which, let's shift gears a bit and head over to Asia. Now, Asia is a massive region with tons of diversity. Where do we even begin?
It's true, there's so much to cover. The report touches on so many countries and issues, but I think a good starting point would be the Ainu people in Japan. They were, and still are, fighting for the Japanese government to recognize them as an indigenous group. It's this fundamental struggle for identity, for cultural survival.
You know, I bet a lot of people might be surprised to hear that there are even indigenous groups within Japan. It kind of challenges that image we have of Japan as this homogenous society.
That's exactly it. It highlights that indigenous peoples exist in all sorts of contexts, even in countries that seem really unified on the surface. The Ainu have their own distinct language, culture, and history, and it's been marginalized for far too long.
It's a reminder that this fight for recognition is happening everywhere. And speaking of fights, the report also mentions the human rights situation of Tibetans under Chinese occupation.
It's a really sensitive and complex issue. The report talks about the suppression of Tibetan culture, their religion, and their language, as well as the displacement of Tibetan communities. It's a situation that continues to raise serious concerns about human rights violations.
Okay, moving on. The report focuses on the Philippines and their Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, or IPRA for short. On the surface, it seems like a positive step.
Oh, it was a landmark piece of legislation, there's no doubt about that. But the report is pretty quick to point out that putting it into practice hasn't gone too smoothly.
So it's that classic problem, right? Good intentions bumping up against reality.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. You have these powerful interests, especially at the local level, that often find ways to block indigenous rights, even when there are laws in place. It's a case of easier said than done, for sure.
The report specifically mentions that struggle for indigenous land rights in the Philippines, despite IPRA existing. It seems like there's always this tension between development and protecting traditional lands.
It's a constant battle, that's for sure.
Yeah.
We see it in the Philippines, just like we saw it in the Americas. Mining, logging, all these development projects, they all put pressure on indigenous communities, pushing them to compromise their way of life.
Okay, so the Philippines are struggling to implement these protections. What about Indonesia? They were going through this period of decentralization. Did that help or hurt indigenous communities?
Decentralization sounds good in theory, right? More power for local communities. But the report suggests it can be a double-edged sword. Without strong safeguards and ways to hold people accountable, it can actually make those existing inequalities even worse.
So instead of power going to the people, it ends up in the hands of local elites, people who might not have the best interests of indigenous communities in mind.
That's exactly the risk.
Yeah.
And the report highlights how important it is for indigenous people to be a part of these decentralized systems. They need to have a voice. They need to be represented. Otherwise, they get left behind.
It feels like a common thread, doesn't it? Indigenous communities need to have a seat at the table when decisions are being made about their land, their resources, their future. Speaking of advocating for change, the report also talks about Malaysia and how Indigenous people were working with the Malaysian Human Rights Commission, or SUHAKAM.
Yeah, that's a really interesting example of how indigenous communities can use these national human rights institutions to address things like land rights violations and discrimination. It's about working within the system to push for change.
It's encouraging to see them being proactive, but then you have a case like Cambodia, where the report mentions this tragic incident. At the Department of Forestry and Wildlife Office, a community representative died during a peaceful protest. It's a stark reminder of how dangerous it can be to speak out against those in power.
It really is. Indigenous activists often put their lives on the line to defend their rights and their land. And what happened in Cambodia shows how important it is for governments to respect the right to peaceful assembly. They need to engage in real dialogue with indigenous communities. Violence is never the answer.
Absolutely. So we've seen examples of legal advocacy, working with human rights institutions, and sadly, peaceful protests being met with violence. What about Vietnam? The report talks about ethnic minority communities in the highlands facing challenges from development projects and restrictions on their religious and cultural expression.
It's another example of development coming at a cost. These big projects like hydropower dams, they often displace indigenous communities. They disrupt their traditional ways of life and damage the environment. And then when you add restrictions on their religious and cultural practices on top of that, it feels like a double blow to their identity.
It's like they're being told, you can develop, but you can't be yourselves. That doesn't sound like progress to me.
No, it doesn't. And you see that same theme of displacement due to development in the report's discussion of Laos, too. They were dealing with a ton of hydropower projects and land concessions that were forcing indigenous communities off their land.
It's frustrating to see that pattern just repeating itself over and over. It makes you wonder who really benefits from these projects and who ends up paying the price. And speaking of paying the price, the report is very frank about the situation in Myanmar, or Burma, as it was often called back then. Militarization, forced labor, human rights violations, it's a grim picture.
Myanmar was particularly bad because of how brutal the military junta was towards ethnic minorities. The report talks about how they used forced labor for resource extraction. And to control these communities, it's a classic example of an authoritarian regime exploiting indigenous peoples and their land for their own gain.
It's a reminder that the fight for indigenous rights is often tied to these bigger fights for democracy and human rights. And speaking of complex situations, let's move on to India. The report covers a whole range of issues there.
Yeah, India has such a vast and diverse indigenous population, and each community faces its own unique set of challenges. The report hones in on a few key areas: the situation in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, the peace talks between the Indian government and the National Socialist Council of Nagaland, or NSCN, and the challenges faced by IWGIA across India.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. Starting with the Chittagong Hill Tracts, what was going on there?
It's a region with a really long history of conflict and displacement. The report analyzes the impact of the peace accord that was signed. It was supposed to resolve the conflict between the Bangladeshi government and indigenous groups in the area.
So a step toward peace, that's always a good thing, but was it actually effective?
Well, the report does acknowledge the peace accord as a positive development, but it also points out that violations of land rights and human rights abuses continued even after it was signed. It highlights how important it is to address those root causes of the conflict, not just try to cover up the symptoms.
It sounds like a really fragile peace, with these deep-seated issues still simmering under the surface.
That's a good way to put it. And those underlying issues: land alienation, discrimination, lack of political representation. They need to be tackled head on if there's going to be any chance of lasting peace.
Okay, so kind of a mixed bag in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. What about the peace talks between the Indian government and the NSCN?
Well, the NSCN have been fighting for an independent Naga homeland for decades. These talks were an attempt to find some kind of political solution, but they were incredibly complicated.
I can only imagine. What were some of the main sticking points?
One of the biggest hurdles was the NSCN's demand for a Nagaland, which would unite all the areas where Naga people lived. This was a problem for the neighboring states and communities. It led to this whole chain reaction of people making claims and counterclaims. It was this delicate balancing act, trying to reconcile those aspirations for self-determination with the need to keep things peaceful and stable in the region.
It sounds like those talks were walking a tightrope, trying to find a solution that would work for everyone.
Exactly. And even today, those Naga peace talks are still ongoing, with all the different factions and stakeholders involved. It's a long and winding road for sure.
Okay, last but not least, the report talks about the IWGIA in India. Who are they, and what kind of challenges were they facing?
Adavasis are a diverse group of indigenous peoples. Sometimes people refer to them as tribal or aboriginal. They make up a significant portion of India's population, but they faced a long history of marginalization and discrimination.
The report specifically mentions forced evictions from forest land and the use of something called the Prevention of Terrorism Act, or POTA, against Adavasis. That's pretty serious.
It is. Adavasis have had their lands and resources taken away from them for a long time. And using POTA basically made it a crime to be an Adivasi. It silenced dissent and was a tool of oppression, plain and simple.
And the report includes this really disturbing account of police violence against Adivasis in Kerala back in February of 2003.
Yeah, that incident was a horrific example of state violence and a lack of accountability. Police opened fire on a peaceful protest, killing and injuring Adivasis, including women and children. It was a truly brutal display of force.
It's just a stark reminder that even in democratic societies, indigenous communities can still face extreme violence and oppression.
Absolutely. And the report also mentions this movement in Kerala called the Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, or AGMS. It was a grassroots movement demanding self-rule and control over their lands and resources.
It sounds like a powerful example of indigenous resistance, pushing back against the forces trying to marginalize them.
It was. The AGMS movement challenged the existing power structures and asserted the right of Adivasis to govern themselves and determine their own future.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground in Asia. It's clear that indigenous communities there are facing a whole web of challenges, from land rights and political representation to just trying to survive and protect their culture. It's a lot to process. All right, so we've made our way through the Americas, Australia, and the Pacific Islands, and Asia. Now let's turn our attention to Africa. It's a huge GE continent, right, with this incredible mix of indigenous cultures.
And it's a continent with a really complex history. Colonialism, conflict, development challenges. And the report does a great job of showing how all of that impacts indigenous rights.
So where do we even start with a continent this big and diverse?
Well, we could start in North Africa, where the Amazi people's fight for recognition really stands out.
The Amazigh. I'm not familiar with that name.
They're the indigenous people of North Africa, sometimes called Berbers. And they've dealt with discrimination and policies trying to force them to assimilate for a long time, especially in countries like Tunisia and Morocco.
Ah, so it's another case of indigenous people within these countries having to fight just to be recognized as distinct, right?
Exactly. And the report highlights how these international groups, like the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, or SUTERD, can help indigenous communities address these long-standing injustices.
It's like they're saying, hey, the world is watching. You can't just ignore this. But moving south, the report takes us to the Sahel region. It's a place we hear a lot about in the news these days, usually in relation to conflict and instability.
Yeah, the Sahel's been dealing with growing insecurity for years now. And the report looks at how this affects the Tuareg communities, particularly in Algeria.
It's interesting how the report connects this to the push for tourism in the region. It's like this clash between economic development, security concerns, and trying to protect indigenous cultures and the environment all at the same time.
Yeah, it's a tough balance to strike. On the one hand, tourism has the potential to bring in money and boost the economy, but you have to make sure it's done in a way that respects indigenous rights and doesn't damage their cultural heritage or the environment.
It reminds us that development isn't always this simple, good thing. It needs to be done carefully, with everyone involved, and with a focus on the long term. Okay, so from the Sahel, we head south to East Africa. What's the situation there?
Well, the report zooms in on the challenges faced by pastoralist communities in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. Pastoralism, that way of life so connected to land and livestock, is under a lot of pressure.
It's a way of life that gets romanticized a lot, but the reality is these communities are facing more and more marginalization and losing their traditional lands.
Absolutely. The report talked about things like land privatization, conservation efforts that limit where they can graze their livestock, and large development projects that disrupt their traditional migration patterns. It's a lot to deal with all at once.
And when we talk about pastoralist communities in East Africa, I immediately think of the Maasai. They're almost iconic. It's sad to hear they're facing these kinds of struggles.
They are, and they're a perfect example of how even well-known indigenous groups aren't immune to the pressures of globalization and development. The report goes into detail about how the Maasai have lost so much land and how that directly impacts their ability to make a living and maintain their cultural practices.
It's particularly disturbing when the report brings up those Tanzanite mines in Mererani and the impact on the Maasai communities there. They even mention children working in the mines. It's heartbreaking.
Child labor is a huge problem, and the report exposes how indigenous children are often the most vulnerable to exploitation, especially in industries like mining. It shows how important it is to have strong laws and enforcement to protect the rights of children.
Okay, so we move from East Africa to Central Africa, and the report shifts focus to the Twa, often called pygmy communities, in Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo.
The Twa are among the most marginalized indigenous groups in Africa. They've experienced centuries of discrimination and exclusion, and the report goes into detail about how war, displacement, and even conservation efforts have taken a toll on their lives.
It's like they're trapped. Conflict, displacement, and then even well-intentioned conservation efforts can end up limiting their access to their traditional lands and resources.
Right, and it's crucial to remember that conservation, while essential, should never come at the expense of indigenous rights. There has to be a way to protect both the environment and the rights of the people who live there.
So what are some of the key things we can learn from the experiences of the Twa in Rwanda and the DRC?
Well, in Rwanda, the report highlights how the Twa are trying to stand up for their rights and work with conservation organizations. They're not just sitting back passively, they're actively trying to protect their interests and have a say in the decisions that affect them.
It's really inspiring to see them taking charge and fighting for their future.
It is. But in the DRC, the situation is much more dire. The report describes horrific violence against indigenous communities during the conflict, including targeted attacks on the Mbuti Pygmies. It's a horrifying reminder of how brutal conflict can be and how vulnerable indigenous peoples are in those situations.
It's a stark reminder that even now in the 21st century, indigenous communities are still facing violence, displacement, and this fight for basic survival.
It's a sobering reality,
Mm.
and it underscores how crucial it is to provide better protection and support for indigenous communities affected by conflict, and to address the root causes of violence and discrimination.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, both literally and figuratively. We've looked at indigenous experiences in the Americas, Australia, the Pacific Islands, Asia, and Africa. What are some of the big takeaways from this global view?
I think one thing that's clear is that indigenous communities around the world are facing this complex web of challenges, from land dispossession and resource exploitation to discrimination, violence, and cultural suppression. But even in the face of all that, there's this incredible resilience, resistance, and determination to assert their rights and protect their cultures and ways of life.
The report mentions the 8th session of the UN Working Group on the Draft Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the creation of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. These seem like big steps forward in the global fight for indigenous rights.
They are. The UN Declaration, which was finally adopted in 2007, was a huge victory in the fight for international recognition of indigenous rights.
Mm.
And the Permanent Forum provides this platform for indigenous peoples to raise their concerns and participate in UN processes.
So even with all these huge challenges, there's hope for progress.
There's always hope. But we have to remember that simply recognizing rights isn't enough. The real work comes in implementing those rights, holding governments and corporations accountable, and creating a world where indigenous peoples can truly thrive, not just survive.
It's a long road ahead, and we've seen setbacks along the way, but ultimately it's a fight worth fighting.
I completely agree. The future of indigenous peoples is intertwined with the future of humanity. Their knowledge, their cultures, their connection to the land, these are valuable lessons for all of us.
This has been an incredible deep dive. So much information, so many stories, so much to reflect on. As we wrap up, is there a final, thought-provoking question for our listeners to consider?
Given all this growing global awareness of indigenous rights back in the early 2000s, how much progress have we actually made in the years since? And what challenges are we still facing in making sure those rights are truly upheld and respected?
It's a question we should all be asking ourselves. And it's a question that can guide our actions and advocacy as we move forward. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to explore the source material for yourselves and keep learning about this crucial topic.